So let's talk about the 9 tissues. Hello. Welcome to episode 14 of the Past Your Prime podcast. I don't know what you were doing with your shoulders there. Today we are going to be talking about tissues. Not Kleenex, though.
Not
For Puffs Plus.
No. We are going to be talking about tissues inside your body that cause you to hurt.
Yeah. Before that, let's jump into our favorite segment, Injury Updates with Alex and Craig.
Cue the music. All right. How's your injury?
My wrist doesn't hurt as bad as it did last week or the week before. I haven't really done anything to help it or hurt it. Yay. I might try and play sports again next week, so we'll see. So it'll hurt again the week after.
Nice. That's good though. So your wrist is feeling better, but how about the nerve part?
I still feel it a little bit. Definitely not as bad as last week. But if I push into really hard extension, I can feel it. I don't know, just a tiny bit. So not too bad.
It's a little surprising you didn't let me mob it today.
Yeah, stay away from it, please. You hurt me. Hurt me.
Well, the nervous system can be very difficult to handle once you actually irritate it the way you have.
Are nerves a tissue?
Nerves are a tissue, which is one of the tissues I think we're going to be dropping into.
Very cool. How's your neck?
My neck feels completely fine. Went through 2 really long drives, 7-8 hour drives. Didn't bother me at all. I did do a whole bunch of burpees, and my back, I thought I tweaked it, but it was more my body just hated me for doing that many burpees.
Yeah. You're just
150 burpees.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yes.
That is a lot of burpees.
Yeah. I want to be, we have this challenge of how long it takes you to do 100 burpees without stopping. And I want to get it sub 5, which would be 20 burpees per minute.
Jeez. I ran a mile.
Yes.
A whole mile consistently without stopping.
Oh, that's actually a really big deal. That's a big number to pass by.
It seems small, but fair enough.
How did your body handle it?
Completely fine. I did it after an upper body workout, so my legs were still fresh. I wore comfortable shoes. I also feel like that helped quite a bit.
What? Wait, so what have you actually been wearing?
Uncomfortable shoes. Yeah.
I have like a picture in my mind, like Bilbo Baggins, you're like barefoot with big old goofy looking feet.
Yeah, I'm wearing moon boots or high heels or something.
Right.
Not heels, but
I could see you run well in those.
Yeah.
You also got new shoes.
I am always getting new shoes. Yeah.
He asked me to bring up, he has some baller shoes on. They're $3,000.
I didn't pay that. Crazy.
They do look cute though. They have some cute.
They're cute. Oh my goodness.
And that's not the compliment you want?
No. All right. Back to tissues. So for episode 14 today, we're going to be talking about the 9 tissues and the pain mechanisms that are associated in rehab.
Yeah, and I have a question for you, Alex. Have you ever had a workout that felt fine, but then afterwards you felt wrecked?
That's pretty much all of my workouts, but it's always 2 days later. I don't get the immediate next day soreness. I get the second day soreness. And I'll usually notice it in the middle of the night where, I've just squatted 2 days ago and now my legs are on fire.
The death fire.
Yeah.
Probably the biggest complaint that I get, second to somebody coming in with an original injury that they can't get a handle on. It's those individuals that come in and they feel just beat down by the fact that they'll do workouts or trying to do things that are really healthy for them. But then once they go do it, and they'll feel fine doing it, the next day they feel like just completely destroyed. And it's such a common problem that it depends on what type of tissue you've hurt and where you're at in your rehab plan and where you're at with your workouts. But it has to be probably the second biggest issue that I run into, is that people will not understand what tissue is causing the pain and not have a realistic timeline on how long it takes for that tissue to actually heal beyond when it's ruining your day and feeling painful every day.
Yeah. Your workout shouldn't ruin your days or your following days.
It definitely should. It definitely should not. And the unfortunate part is that all those tissues that we're going to hit 9 of them today, they heal at different rates.
Right. Timeliness, not timelines.
The timeline matters.
Right.
Right.
Okay. So our focus, we have a couple of focuses for the episode today. So the first one is understanding how different tissue respond to activity progression. Number 2 will be recognizing the signs of overload and adjustments that you can make to avoid setbacks. Next are the healing timelines that we just mentioned. And then lastly, we'll go over the pain mechanisms and why some pain persists. I like my nerve pain in my wrist, just keeps persisting.
I think it'll give us a good start, a good place to jump off to go into deeper dives later on in different podcasts. But the idea today is to hit the 9 big ones. I want to see if I can actually hit it. It's hard to remember them all. So we have bone, disc, joint, ligaments, muscle, tendon, tenosynovium, nerve.
Don't forget the fascia.
And the fascia. The fascia, which is kind of the what did they call John Wick? The Russian guy, the boogeyman.
I don't watch movies.
You don't watch movies? You've never watched John Wick?
Nope.
Oh my. Okay. Well, we have another.
Uncultured.
You don't watch movies?
Rarely. I have a 5-year-old.
Does the 5-year-old watch movies?
Yeah.
So-
Moana.
Do you watch the Moana with her?
Well, yeah.
Okay, so you watch movies. You just watch 5-year-old level movies. Okay. Dude, did you watch movies before?
No.
Wow. Okay, so you're one of those people.
Yep.
Well, just as a reminder,
I just watched this podcast.
this is the only thing you watches. That is actually shocking. This topic is very important if you're in the rehab standards. So remember, we think that there's 3 standards. You have the rehab standard, your exercise standard, and performance standard. The rehab standard, at the end of the day, it just means that you train your tissue capacity, not at your exercise capacity. And that's really hard to figure out if you don't understand first what tissue is causing it. And if you don't have a good key sign, we're going to hit those today by going over signs that you're overloading the tissue. Exercise standard is just getting that exercise habit, making sure you're showing up, doing it day after day, hitting the basic foundational workouts and activities that'll get you to where you want to go. The final one, the performance standard, the one that Alex is starting to move into, is going after sports specific, or not even sports specific, any specific goal that you really want to hit. And you're doing specific programming to hit it.
What is my specific goal?
Jump higher. He wants a higher vertical, and he wants to be able to spike harder. Spiker. He wants to spiker harder.
Spiker kiker here.
Spiker kiker. He wants to spike harder and volley harder.
I just want to volley so hard.
Yes. That's it sounds so
I just
weird
trained to
say it
volley.
that way.
Just train to volley my best volley.
You're the libero.
Stop.
Is that a term? Is that not a volleyball term?
I will say my favorite coach made me play libero because I sucked at passing. This was like 15 years ago, but yeah, the libero's the passer. It's normally a little guy. I'm not a little guy.
Well, that aside, that he wants to play libero again, overload does not always have to cause pain during the workout that you're doing it. And it doesn't always have to hurt during the exercise. And that's the key to understand, is that when you're training tissue capacity, you have to recognize if there's symptoms during the exercise. That's the first hurdle to pass. And then after that, does it hurt after the workout? That's the second hurdle. And then the next hurdle is, does it hurt the next day or preceding days as you start to add volume and more load consistently over time? And you can have where you don't hurt after the first workout, you don't hurt the second workout, but you hurt after the third in the same week. Those are all signs that you're overloading your tissue capacity. And that's why you have to know which tissue is hurting you.
So, and that's different than like muscle soreness from a standard workout, rather than like if my wrist were to actually have pain, or, a blow up of the nerve pain that I've been having. That's different than just regular muscle soreness.
It's very different, except if the tissue that you hurt was muscle. Right?
That's one of the tissues.
Yeah, so if the tissue that you hurt was muscle, then muscle soreness would also be something you're trying to avoid. And there's cases where people will have this delayed onset muscle soreness, the DOMS, and they had a muscle strain, and they keep on re-irritating the muscle strain. And because they can't tell the difference between a normal, I was gonna say pleasant, a normal pleasant muscle soreness versus a soreness where they've actually now strained the muscle. And so it's really clear. So if you have a muscle strain, you really don't want to produce DOMS during the rehab standard. You actually don't want to have muscle soreness. You want to have the muscle feel good, comfortable, and to respond to the exercise load. Because if you do more, it's really hard to thread the needle on not overloading it.
Injury versus just pleasant soreness.
Pleasant soreness. And so this is absolutely the place where pleasant soreness and unpleasant soreness are both viewed negatively.
Pleasant soreness versus exquisite pain.
We'll go into that. We'll go more into that when we hit the muscle physiology podcast.
Okay, so let's talk about the 9 tissues. You already listed them. Let's talk about some of the overload indicators for each of those tissues.
Okay.
What are we going to start with?
Let's hit nerve.
That's what I'm dealing with. So.
Yes. Well, tell us what have you noticed with your nerve injury?
It's such an odd feeling because it just feels like a shocking pain that kind of goes through the fatty part just below my thumb. I don't know what that's called medically, but yeah, that area just, if I go too far into extension or kind of push the extension with resistance, I get just a random shocking pain with various levels of intensity to that shocking feeling. And it just, I don't know, it's like very quick. It's like a little lightning bolt going through my hand, and I don't know, it just kind of sucks. I don't.
That just kind of sucks.
If that would just go away, then aside from that, I'm like 80%, 90% to having full extension, and I'd be, much better off and be able to do my volleyballs.
Is that how you say that?
I was going to try and make more and more fun of your volleyball term.
Well, you bring up a great point in that he has 2 separate tissues that he's dealing with. He has a joint injury. Well, you have 3. You had a bone injury, joint injury, and you have a nerve injury. And right now, the leading problem is actually your nerve injury. And that kind of hits the complexity of a rehab plan has to incorporate all those 3 tissues. And it's always frustrating when you come into a rehab plan that's just been really, really mismanaged, and you have somebody who basically has ignored 1 or 2 of the tissues that are also part of your pain presentation. In this case, his symptoms are very clearly nerve. The idea of it's shocking, it's electrical, lancinating, burning, tingling. Those are things that make you start to think nerve, because what the nerve does is it takes a signal, especially where he has it. It's an afferent nerve, which means it's a sensory nerve, and it basically transmits the information up to his spinal cord. And he has these efferent nerves that come back down, and they transmit information to his muscles to make his muscles produce actions. Now, they can get very irritated when you have an injury like he had, because the nerve is basically passing through where you have the injury. And that chemical irritation and compression can actually cause the nerve now become reactive. So typically nerves, unless they've been irritated, you don't get any of these sensations. So the first sign of overload is going to be the shocking symptom that he's feeling, or the nervy symptoms that he's feeling. The other thing you can also get is muscle weakness.
And I've experienced a ton of that. I mean, I think I talked about it last week, where I was trying to just pick up, 40-pound dumbbells to do bench or shoulder press. I don't know what exercise I was doing, but my grip strength was so weak in the one arm that it was laborious to try and get that weight into the right position. Once I got it there, I could do the exercise, but just lifting certain objects has been just weirdly painful when my wrist is irritated with this nerve pain.
There are times when people come in and they'll have weakness with no pain, and it's nerve. Really common with neck injuries, where people will lose the ability to do tricep extension. That's a C7 nerve root injury. And they'll be surprised, because then they'll look back and we'll show them, it's like, you don't have muscle there. They'll have profound atrophy. Now, if we understand that the idea is that it's transmitting signals, it's telling your muscle what to do, and it's also giving you feedback, and so you can get these paresthesias, these abnormal sensations that are coming in because the nerve is irritated. The first sign of overload is that those symptoms increase. And you have to absolutely respect when a nerve is starting to give you those signs. You do not push past it. It doesn't matter if all it is almost a feeling that it just doesn't feel quite right, or tingly, or a little bit off, a little bit less sensation than the other side. Tools that we'll use would be any of those. You actually even said his key sign last time, if you guys remember, was now gripping strength.
Yeah.
Gripping strength is a great one if you have a nerve injury that basically is irritating and causing the muscles in your hands not to fire well. If he starts to feel that he's losing grip strength, it doesn't matter if the workout's going well in every other way. He's overloading what that nerve can actually handle. He's either getting chemical irritation, mechanical pressure, something in the environment's not letting the nerve operate normally, and he's overloading that tissue.
I do it all the time.
He's very skilled. You are good for the bottom line, though.
Yeah, I'm very good at hurting myself.
Which I think is really nice. Now, biggest mistake here, though, is people will feel tightness with nerve injuries. So they have the sensory changes, they'll have the motor changes, but then they also will complain of tightness. And what's the first thing that people want to do when it's
stretch? Stretch.
Do not stretch this. If you stretch an irritated nerve, literally every nerve test other than the Tennell's test, where you basically put pressure on them and smack the nerve, they're stretch tests that you literally stretch you stretch the nerve to make it feel worse, to indicate that it's the part of your pain. Do not stretch an irritated nerve. It's the number one, if I had to say the number one mistake in rehab, is stretching tissues that you think you're doing it therapeutically when you're actually just making the tissues worse.
Don't want to make your tissues worse.
Not unless you want to make me more money. and I think it's just a big mistake.
Yeah.
Second big mistake is not treating the tissue that's causing the chemical irritation. So in this situation, it could be that the joint is irritated and it's spitting off a little bit of chemistry in the area that's causing the nerve to be sensitized to stretch or pressure. You have to rehab that tissue. But the other thing that can happen is, have you ever heard of carpal tunnel syndrome?
I have.
So carpal tunnel syndrome is typically injuries in two separate spots, neck and your wrist. You have to treat both. So if he told me his wrist was hurting, but he also has been waking up with a lot of neck pain, we also have to treat the neck. So you want to make sure that your key signs are the things that you're checking for overload. You have to look for the things that could also be irritating the nerve. So another common example, I have chronic recurrent neuropathic pain from an injury back in football. My back can produce that symptom. So I can't just treat where it peripheralizes, which is in my foot. I also have to treat my back at the same time. So the other big issue is, don't ignore the other things that can cause the nerve to be irritated.
That's the same with like my back and my calf.
It is. It's the exact same.
Yeah.
So that's why for him, when he starts to get calf tightness, he does flossing at the calf. Nerve flossing, and then back traction. And working those two together actually improve the tissue health and the tissue capacity of the nerve. Final thing is, when you're doing a neurofloss or a nerve glide, don't turn it into a stretch. So it should not be really felt. It should be relieving. It should reduce some of your symptoms, whether that's tingling. It'll even make your grip strength stronger if you're doing it correctly. What we see often is that people will do it so hard that they feel a stretch, and then they'll actually have a worsening of their key sign, whether that's the paresthesia, the muscle weakness. Don't go too far with it. It'll actually make it feel worse.
Don't make yourself feel worse. We say that all the time.
Don't make yourself feel worse. Nerve injuries take a long time.
That was going to be the next point. What is the timeline for healing a nerve injury?
If it's a minor irritation, 3 to 6 weeks. If it's, we call it a double cross syndrome, or there's multiple areas where the nerve is getting irritated, I typically see that take a lot longer, but that's because you're triggering it all the time. But if you have a severe nerve injury where you've had muscle wasting, changes to your reflexes, changes to your sensation, I can take 6 months to years to heal. And when I have a nerve injury like this, even if it's a minor one and I'm thinking 3 to 6 weeks, you're going to have no symptoms, I still like to treat it for 6 months after your last symptom.
I've been dealing with it for probably 2 months, maybe 3 months. Yeah.
Well, you're
but I keep irritating.
Yes.
Yeah. So it hasn't just been all feeling better. I've been getting to a place where I can do athletic activities, regressing, rehabbing, and kind of going through that cycle.
Thread the needle. You're still going to hurt it.
Yeah.
You're still going to do some things around it. It's just being aware when it happens. You actually have a great key sign now with the grip strength.
Yeah. And it does feel like I'm building the tissue capacity. So that's the ultimate goal here.
I do think nerves are sometimes the scariest tissue.
And it's one where there's not an easy way to just make it go away, as where with, some of the tendon stuff, which I think we're going to jump into tendons next. I've been able to make some of the tendon pain go away in my wrist, where the nerve pain just isn't going away as easily.
If you struggle with it, that typically means that you've lost a feedback loop. So with one of them that we've had to switch from his front is not the shocking pain. If he gets the shocking pain, it's already gone too far and he's going to have a large setback. The reason the gripping one is good is that it's catching him overloading it even sooner. So the fastest, the best test that you can have for a key sign, which we obviously need to go in depth on how you find your own key signs. But for him, he can find a grip weakening earlier in the cycle, which means that he's not going to irritate it so bad that the next 4 or 5 days, he's going to be getting more and more shocks. And that's the key is you want to push it to the edge, but you don't want to push past the edge.
Right. But you want to push past your prime.
But you want to push past your price. I don't know where that one. Oh, yeah, there we go. All right, next one.
Tendons.
Okay. Tendons they connect your muscle to bone. That's the purpose of a tendon. There's muscle to kind of go dorky on it where it connects to another tendon, but we're not going to go into that one. Now, your tendons really have, to me, I think when you look at it, you have two purposes. One to either transmit force, and other one's to produce motion. The ones that produce motion, like obviously with your hands, they go through these tunnels, and we'll get into tenosynovium in a second. Those produce motion. The ones we're going to talk about, these tendons, are actually the ones that transmit force. The most common ones that you'll think of would be your Achilles tendon and your patellar tendon, your quad tendon in your knee. The ones that seem to get hurt the most often, where people come in and they have this achy, kind of gross pain that hurts every time the force gets transmitted through it.
That'd be like front of the knee, obviously back of the ankle, calf area for your Achilles.
Two most common areas. The other really common one that often gets missed is your posterior tibialis is a really common one on the inside of your ankle. It's the primary controller of pronation when your foot hits the ground. But those are going to be like your big ones. It's because they're dealing with tremendous amounts of force. Every time that you take a step, you're basically going to land and you're going to load it. Every time you take a step, every time you walk, you're loading those tendons an incredible amount.
Is that one that would get hurt with like an ankle sprain?
Ankle sprains can get hurt with an ankle sprain. The post tib can, especially if it's trying to control it, but it's more often that's going to be your peroneal tendons on the ones on the outside. If you're doing you have an inversion ankle sprain, those are all can easily be overloaded because your body, we don't realize it, but our body handles crazy amounts of load just with walking. We just do it really well.
And we'll talk about ligaments later. I think that's
the other big one.
Yeah, the other big one. So pain lingering with activity is a normal one that we'll see in the tendons. What else are we looking for with tendon issue injury?
Tendons like load. You have to load tendons for them to heal. If they're not being loaded, the tendon itself becomes disorganized. So your body is always putting tissue down and pulling tissue off. And loading the tendon is actually what helps the body understand where to put the new tissue for the tendon down. Because a healthy tendon it's really smooth and it's oriented in the right direction. Like if we took a biopsy and we looked at how the structure of it is laid down, when a tendon gets hurt and it's hurt over a chronic period of time, it'll look like a big disorganized mess. And when that happens, you can get angiogenesis, where you get new blood vessels in the area. This is an area where we don't want new blood flow. Like it'll actually make it worse. You get ingrowth of free nerve endings, things that basically allow you to experience more pain. Those are all really bad things. You don't want a gross, disorganized, highly vascularized tendon. It's just, that's not going to be healthy. And it's going to be one of those things when that happens to people, the tendon becomes unhealthy and becomes quite painful. Now, signs that you're overloading it. So let's say we got through that phase. You're now ready to start loading it. tendons can actually handle some level of pain. The general rule of thumb is 3 out of 10 pain. What I find, for example, somebody like Alex, there's no way in hell I would tell him 3 out of 10. I'd lower the number down, because 3 out of 10 for him, he's going to change his mind on what 3 out of 10 is halfway through the workout, because he's going to hurt, and then he's going to blow it past, and he's going to take it to like a 7 out of 10 and tell himself that it was a 3 out of 10.
You're not wrong.
I'm not wrong. Yeah, I'm not wrong. So one of the most important pieces with tendon pain is that you can load it. You don't want to overload it. Signs that you overloaded it would be the pain builds during the workout. It should not build. It should drop. The first set may be a little bit uncomfortable, but then you should see the pain start to reduce. If it starts to increase, you're overloading it. It's not working. Go back to your home plan. Go back to the tools that make it feel better. You can keep loading it. You just don't want to overload it.
Right.
The other big one would be all of a sudden it becomes really stiff.
Now,
Stiff.
on stiffness, I've heard that like tendon stiffness, specifically with your knees, is kind of a good thing.
Well, it is. You want stiffness in a tendon is not a bad thing. You don't want.
But it's the feeling of stiffness that's different than like the structural stiffness.
Yes.
Okay.
There's a big difference. And when people say stiffness, what they're trying to say is it transmits force. So to take a really crazy example, I've rehabbed a few people with complete tears of their Achilles tendon, and they did it without having surgery. Now, what happens to that tendon is you basically have to put it so that the tendon pieces are really close to each other. They basically come back together. But over time, that tendon will actually lengthen more than it should. So it'll never have the same spring behavior that it did before the tear. Now, when somebody is saying that they want increased stiffness, they want the spring to be a better spring. They want it to be a better transmitter of force. I completely understand that. But this kind of feeling of stiffness, that's a sign that you're overloading it, and it's actually not handling whatever load you are passing through it. And that's a big difference. First, what I think you're talking about, which is a training effect.
Right. Just to increase vertical, run faster, be more athletic.
Exactly. If you don't feel it during the workout, but then the next day it feels dramatically worse. I know that have you woken up the next day, and then when you get out of bed, it feels like everything is crazy painful, like Achilles tendon, knee tendon. That would be a sign of overload. Right. So this is one that you can have like a 12 to 24 hour feedback loop, and it can feel really stiff, and then it'll go away. And if every time after your workout, you have that crazy stiffness 24 hours later when you wake up, you're overloading it during the workout. So your actual feedback loop is beyond the workout. It's going to be the next morning,
2 or 3 days later,
that you're going to judge if you overloaded it or not.
What is the healing timeline for tendons?
Well, what's interesting is the way that they'll say it is that it's pretty short, 3 to 6 months for a chronic. They say 6 to 12 weeks for acute. I don't find that useful, because it's always being reorganized. Even when we see quite a few patients who come in after getting like a PRP injection, and they sometimes have to get repeated injections, and they'll look to see that the tendon is actually healing after each one of the injections. I find that this one, the most important thing is that you're not getting symptoms, and that this can sometimes take up to a year in my experience, where you'll fully get out of the symptoms recurring, but you can see it, and you could be almost pain-free after 2 to 3 weeks, but your tendon itself is still going to be healing. And I think at a minimum it's 6 weeks, so you actually get the tissue turnover. But if it's chronic, you're looking at a year. Chronic, and you're starting to see actual tendon structure changes, like a thickening, or you'll sometimes get nodules in the tendon. It takes a very long time for that tissue to be reabsorbed, if it even does. Now, with these tendons that transmit huge amounts of force, your body recognizes that there's a cross-sectional area that it needs to be able to transmit that load. And so when it starts to see this kind of gross degenerated tendon, it'll basically add on tendon around it.
Right.
And sometimes that doesn't go away. So you'll get actual nodules that stay in the tendon, especially the Achilles tendon, that don't go away.
And especially, I'm testing it every, 3 to 4 weeks. And so I'm having little setbacks, and then having to reprogress through the rehab standard to get it back feeling pretty good or close to pain-free. Then I set myself back a little bit. So I can see that it would take a little bit longer, especially if you're kind of constantly testing to see if it's feeling better.
More so than any other tissue, I like to flirt with loading it on this one, where you want to be loading it, and getting that the right amount is actually a bit more tricky. And so if it's lingering, it means that you're overloading it, even if you're staying below that 3 out of 10, even if you're respecting that the pain feels better at the end of your workouts, and even if you're not seeing any symptoms the next day. If it's not completely going away, you're still overloading it.
Good. Let's move on to joints, I think, are next on our 9 tissue list. What do joints do?
So joints absorb force, they allow for movement, allow us to be functional. But the biggest thing with a joint is it's where two bones basically meet, obviously. Now, joint injuries, there's something important to remember about joints. Joints are surrounded by a capsule. The capsule itself can also be reactive, and the capsule basically keeps fluid inside the joint, so the joint's actually able to stay mobile, stay healthy. What can happen with joints, though, is especially lower extremity, but really anywhere. You've jammed your finger before.
Not in a door, because I don't do that.
I do like that. That is my favorite analogy. Don't jam your finger in a door and then slam the door on it over and over again. Not healthy for any body part. Now with a joint, though, that you walk on or that you do any activity with, and what'll happen is it's very easy to overload an irritated joint, and the way it presents is you'll lose motion. It'll feel stiffer. It'll lose motion. Certain joints you can even see swelling. Very easy to see it in the knee. Very easy to see it in like the elbow. Other places you can be a little bit more tricky, but you can often appreciate that there's actually an increase in swelling inside the capsule. And when you have that, what'll happen is 2 things. It'll feel stiffer and you lose motion. Second thing is you will find muscles that surround the joint actually don't fire as well. So it'll feel almost like stiff and jerky and not comfortable.
What are the modifications you make for joints? Is this another one where you love stretching for it?
Do not stretch an irritated joint. No, I do not like stretching. I just don't like stretching. So you can make an assumption that I'm going to say no to stretching because it's just the stupidest mistake that we see over and over again.
I find myself judging people at the gym when they're stretching now. Like, Craig thinks you're an idiot. You shouldn't be stretching.
If you enjoy it and you have no issues, but man, it would surprise you how often somebody comes in, pays us, and we're just like, well, just don't stretch, and then they come back and they're shockingly better. It is, if you're going to do anything from anything to say, try not stretching for a week if you have an active injury and see what happens. It'll blow your mind.
On the opposite end of that, traction, mobilization
work very well.
Work very well
for this one. Now, the nice thing with joints, with this specific tissue, tractioning between working sets is really, really helpful. Noticing any level of stiffness, traction it immediately, and you can actually be very aggressive with joint injuries. If you're actively tractioning in between, making sure that the muscles are being loaded really well. Big part too that we see often is you start to develop co-contractions. What that means is that muscles that cross the joint also load the joint. So any muscle that crosses a joint and you produce force, part of that force is also compressing the joint. If you have an injury to the joint, oftentimes what will happen is the threshold for those muscles to fire lowers. And so those, even though they become less active, they'll fire more often and together. And that co-contraction is really unhealthy for the joint.
Don't do things that are unhealthy for your joint.
Don't do anything unhealthy for the joint. So cyclical activity, repetitive activity, those things are really healthy, but just make sure that you're monitoring if you lose any motion.
What's the healing timeline for joints?
Man, same thing. This one's, you'll see it's about 6 weeks if it's like an acute injury, but 3 to 6 months if you're chronically, recurringly irritating it, and it's been something that you've been dealing with for a long time. Now, one of the things that can happen with these joints, though, is you can actually lose motion. You can get what are called contractures. Contractures can take years to correct. I have some individuals where we get their most common one we'll see is like knee joint, for example. They'll lose flexion and extension and say they have a 15 degrees from full extension. That's going to take maybe a year to a year and a half of keeping it pain-free and then gradually getting the extension back And the same thing for flexion. So it can take 2 to 3 years to fully regain motion. But if you regain that motion, you can often prevent a total knee.
I'm kind of there with my wrist where I'm probably got, I'm almost a year into the injury. It'll be a year this summer. And I don't know, I'd be great, but this summer I had 100% extension, but I'd imagine it'll probably go beyond that.
Yours is interesting because the nerve piece makes it way more difficult, because we could get way more aggressive with it, but the nerve part is concerning. But I find that these joints, if you make the joint feel good, you'll gain motion, and then you basically do long mobilization holds that are really help with regaining motion, and then you do activities that regain the mobility. Now, this is one of the areas where I don't mind stretching as much, but they're going to be long holds where you basically hold it for a really long period of time, where you're causing the tissue basically to deform, and you're holding it for a really long time. You don't really need to do that for muscle, but you can do that for some of the connective tissues.
Nice. So let's just jump into muscles next.
Muscles.
What do muscles do?
Now, they produce movement, they absorb force. They're really a window into how your nervous system is functioning and working. You'll find that muscle strains, in my opinion, I don't typically see those happen in a vacuum. They're often coinciding with a separate injury somewhere else. I think the muscle is very responsive to any injury to any of the other tissues. So if you have a joint irritation, the muscle probably is going to also respond, developing trigger points, be more prone to a muscle strain. But let's just say it's just purely a muscle strain, like a muscle that you basically take and you tear the muscle. Now, even in those situations, once again, you don't start with stretching. Like, I'm going into a rehab mindset, but the sign that you're overloading this is going to be excessive muscle soreness, especially in the area where the strain happened.
With my calf muscle injury, I feel like I was stretching it too often because, I don't know, like the calf stretch, I feel like that's just like very common in all jumping sports, running sports. It's like you go and you do your calf stretch, but that can be, once again, counterintuitive to actually making it feel better. It might feel better in the moment, but actually helping the tissue capacity or tissue progression, it's kind of the other way around.
Yeah, excessive soreness is the big one, and the tightness that you're feeling means you overloaded it. If you start to feel tightness, it's not because all of a sudden the muscle says it needs to be stretched. It's because it's not handling the load you're putting through it. With his calf, the secondary piece, though, you had a nerve injury on top of it.
Right. That came much far after my calf.
Yeah, because he had a full tear of a component of the calf, of the gastrocnemius, and you actually have a divot. He has a divot now in his beautiful, massive calf, and so
it's still huge.
It's
noticeable. It's less noticeable.
But you put socks over he covers it up now. He doesn't.
I don't. I love my calves. I show them.
Yeah, and so it's covered when he goes and works out now, which you don't have to be embarrassed when you start to show some of these tears off.
I show everybody because I think it looks cool, and it's like still huge. Like how your calf's still this big and you're missing one of the muscles.
Yeah, it's
impressive.
It's really impressive. So, couple signs that you're overloading it. Trigger points. By far, that's the biggest one. If you start to develop these exquisitely tender, just like almost feels like a little ball. It also can kind of feel like a thread that's too prominent in the muscle belly. That's a sign that you're overworking that muscle. Second one is that it cramps. If you start to notice cramping, and it could be cramping in that muscle or any of the associated muscles around it that do either synergistic work with it or the opposite action, those can also cramp. Now, if cramping happens, it's a sign that the muscle threshold for the muscle to fire is too low. You can do things to increase that threshold.
It's also a sign that you're not eating enough bananas.
That's what they say. I'm not sure. We can definitely get into the physiology of cramping.
But I used to get calf cramps all the time, and I wonder if that was associated to stretching, because I haven't stretched my calves in years now. I've just done the nerve flossing.
Do they cramp now?
I haven't had a calf cramp in a while. I feel like sometimes I get on that treadmill, I'm like, oh, I'm going to fall down because my calves are going to cramp, but they haven't cramped yet.
My dad's going to love that one.
Yeah.
Come here. Now, the last one is excessive soreness. Late onset muscle soreness. Alex likes it. In this piece. I don't want you to have excessive muscle soreness. If you have excessive muscle soreness, you're overloading this tissue. Once you're past it, it's healed, you're back to normal. I don't care if you push hard, but the biggest piece is no cramps. We shouldn't see an increase in trigger points. You shouldn't have excessive soreness, and you should gradually increase it. Now, when you're actually doing the work, you should be doing targeted exercises for that muscle specifically. It shouldn't be as part of a huge group. You need to have things that are actually targeting it and that are monitorable. So like for the calf, one of our most common standards would be 25 calf raises on that single leg with no cramping, no trigger points, no excessive muscle soreness, full height. We know the calf is back.
Yeah. What's the healing timeline for a calf?
Man,
Mine was pretty lengthy.
well,
I had a full tear.
you had a full tear. A full tear can be complicated. It can be complicated because then you have to regain the full muscle strength without that muscle ever coming back. Like that muscle's not coming back. The piece that you tore. People will say 2 to 8 weeks. I find it to be considerably longer. But I think people will close off the timeline. They'll say, okay, it's healed, but then they ignore signs that it's not doing well, like the cramping, the excessive soreness, the trigger points. I find that true muscle injuries get under rehab dramatically, and it's really, really common. And the signs that it's not handling load well are ignored, and then people just avoid the activity.
I mean, mine still gives me problems. I don't even know how long it's been, 6 years, 8 years later. So,
and he tests very strong for the calf. He's not getting the cramping, which is a good sign, but it's something that it's going to monitor because he actually tore a piece of the calf. People with recurring hamstring strains, I often just think that you're not getting the full strength back, and then you don't retrain the movement that hurt it initially. It's like a hamstring strain. You need to make sure it's really strong eccentrically, and you build up and you do challenging activities that allow it to regain its robusticity. But if you don't do that, and we say 8 weeks and it's healed, I'm pretty confident you're going to re-tear it,
reoccurrence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Recurrence.
I still get the knots and all those other things in there, but
you manage it.
Foam rolling and,
Yeah.
Other soft tissue stuff seems to help along with the flossing.
You will be prone to tearing it and hurting it again over and over again. So it's just one of them that I like to have just a permanent plan around, maybe only a minute, put in tissue work on it, making sure that it's activated and using a key sign to test to make sure that it didn't all of a sudden stop testing painful or testing weak. But 8 weeks would be the shortest I would allow. If it's a muscle strain, maybe even shorter. But if it's truly torn, you're looking at months.
Yeah, I want to say it was probably 4 to 6 months for mine, and then a little bit more training, and I was able to get back to jumping again. But yeah, it was definitely a slow progression.
You got it.
Okay, next up we've got discs.
Ooh, all right.
What do discs do other than we throw them when we play frisbee golf?
Okay, well, that's not accurate for the disc we're talking about. We're talking about discs that go between your spinal vertebrae. You remember you have a cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. Between each of those, you have discs, except for the top 2 vertebrae in your neck don't have discs. All the rest of them do. And a disc has an outer layer called your annulus, has an inner layer called your nucleus. Now, the nucleus is mostly water. The outer layer, the annulus, is really similar to what a ligament would be, like that we'll talk about in a second. It absorbs force. It can also help to give more mobility and motion for the spine, but mostly it's going to be a force absorber. And it's an area that often gets hurt along with the vertebral end plate, especially if we're talking about the lumbar spine. Now, there's different, I'm just going to go down kind of the typical way the pathology presents. You can have what's called an internal disc disruption. You can have an outer disc irritation just to the outer aspect of the annulus. You can have different types of compromise to the outer layer. So you can have a protrusion, a prolapse, and an extrusion. Those are just different ways that the inner part starts to push through the annulus.
Not good.
No, those would be ones that people are like, oh, you have a herniation or a disc bulge. Now, the different types of injuries have very different timelines. the disc itself doesn't have a blood supply, but once you start to break through the annulus, or if you fracture the vertebral end plate, you get blood into it, and that's part of the degradation process of a disc. That's one of the things that happens anytime you're being active. You may get you may overload it, and then it heals, but you now got blood into the disc. Your body does not have a good response to that, and it'll cause it to start to lose integrity.
Yeah. Disc pain, I feel like, is not anything to play with. Same thing where traction can help.
And some of them it won't change it at all. It's really where we'll play around with a whole bunch of different treatments and see which one the person has a better response with.
There's also just a ton of tissues in your back, so it's hard to tell, like, okay, is it my spinal cord? Is it a muscle in the back?
That's why a detailed exam is really helpful, right? You have these tests, things that could indicate if it's nerve. You can check for nerve root health. You can check motion. You can do PAs. There's a whole bunch of different tests that you can do. This one, let's say we're past that. Now we're talking about overloading the tissue, and you want to see if you don't want to have a setback. Active range of motion is one of the most obvious ones. Try and touch your toes side to side, lean back, and you can do that for any level from cervical to thoracic to lumbar spine. The other big one would be if you start to get any, say there was a nerve component we already went over, you want to monitor for those ones as well. Stiffness in the area, or even feeling like your muscles are getting tight. Those are also signs that you're overloading it. So even though it feels like it's the muscle responding to your disc having a bad response. Those are just big warning signs that the way that you're loading it's too much. This one I find has some of the nastiest morning pain. If you had a good workout and you think it's good, the next day you wake up and you feel like you have a full setback on your low back, it's common.
Yeah, you just got beat over the back with a baseball bat.
Yeah. Don't take a bat to the back. That's a really good rule of thumb. It's a really good rule of thumb. Very similar to joint injuries. I love when you find something that helps it, do whatever helps it. Traction, lumbar traction, cervical traction, ball on the wall, the neural flossing, TA activation, core recoordination exercises, anything that makes it feel better. Do it between working sets of exercise, and it'll make it so that your back, your disc handles whatever loads you're doing to it better. The disc actually does respond well to cycles of load, and it can be very, very healthy for the disc. And it's not about being completely inactive on it, but it is a piece of it that can be really tricky. And this is where a key sign of checking to see if motion changes start to hurt, or if you start to feel stiffness or pain in the back. You have to monitor those, because pushing through in this situation does not make sense.
Yeah, and I think you just have to take it slow. When I was kind of first coming back from my wrist injury, I went crazy on doing legs, and I was able to do a lot of weight with my quad strength, but my back was not prepared for that amount of load. So I had to kind of like take it slow, build that capacity up. And then I was able to, do closer to 1 rep maxes.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And when you've gone through it one time where you've had a really irritated back and you've managed it, you'll start to learn signs that you're overdoing it. Don't be afraid of using the tools that you found and being aggressive with it right from the start. You don't have to wait to do the traction to come see a physical therapist or whoever you were working with before. If you found something that worked before, you test that first. Don't stretch it.
Yeah, that one just seems to have the biggest significance in terms of daily activity as well. Like when your back hurts, it's just hard to do everything else. So take care of your back.
We do find it useful in these situations to look for interactions. And an interaction is anything that causes the symptoms to hurt. If you do it by itself, it's fine. But if you do it followed by this other thing, there's an interaction between the two and that causes it to feel worse. Sitting, for example, followed by an exercise, or exercise followed by sitting. That's where something like a lumbar brace can be really helpful, or a cervical collar, anything that basically causes your spine to be more stable without you having to think about it can be really helpful. Those are things to play around with if you find that, hey, I'm actually handling the workouts well. I'm having no change in key sign, but I'm waking up the next day feeling worse. You could be having an interaction. So maybe after you get done working out, you put the lumbar brace on for the first 2 to 3 hours after you work out.
Healing timeline for discs.
Man, same thing. discs do heal, but the timeline is very different based on the type of disc injury you had. It can be anywhere from, I mean, there's some studies that show that when you have any of these significant disc injuries, the remodeling never actually stops. So it depends on what you mean by healing. For it to be symptom-free, it can take a week to a month to get it really symptom-free, to get it through this kind of how we're talking about getting through the rehab standard. It can take anywhere between 2 to 6 months to a year, to sometimes people get a chronic lumbar instability that is something that they constantly manage, and they're having to really pay attention to this more than anything else, or not something that goes away.
If you're injured forever. I think we said that in one of the early podcasts. So
That sounds so dark.
yeah, it is. Okay, next up are bones. Bones are a tissue,
Ooh, bones are a tissue.
and those provide the structure of your body.
I think they do.
Okay.
Yeah, bones do. Bone rehab is one of my favorite. The most
My
common
least
ones-
favorite.
Really? Well, yeah,
Probably because I'm going through it currently.
they're not fun. Now, my biggest experience, I deal a lot with people who get stress fractures from running or sport. It's interesting how hard people will want to push, but bone doesn't really lie. Like if you get a bone pain, it's like a gross kind of aching.
Mine didn't hurt when I broke it, which was, I mean, I had some pain in the joint, but the typical test is you just push on the specific bone. And, you know, when I went and saw the ortho, he was like, "Does this hurt?" I was like, "No." He's like, "You don't have a broken bone." It's like, okay, well, x-ray says I have a broken bone, so help me out here.
Well, the big part on that's a stress reaction or stress fracture. It's from repetitive load to the bone, and to the point where it loses integrity and it fractures. Yours was a fracture due to somebody running into you and you hitting really hard on the ground.
Right.
Yeah. The guy who ran into you, he got destroyed by you, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, he had to give up volleyball because Alex hit him so hard. But
I jumped over it.
yeah. Now, a stress reaction or a stress fracture means the bone's not handling the repetitive stresses that are going through the bone. We find that oftentimes people are under consuming calories, or they're not getting enough of the nutrients that they need for the bone to stay healthy and handle the repetitive stresses that are going through it. Now, in this one, I find bone injuries to be very easy to tell, because if it hurts, you're overloading the bone. The only tricky piece on this is if another tissue is also causing pain. And it's not uncommon for people to have separate injuries that coincide with where the pain's being experienced.
I was having kind of all of that with the tendon, the nerve. We thought it might be the bone in the first time I came back to play volleyball a couple of months ago. And I thought all of those were intertwined in what was going on. So it made it hard to...
You had 3 injuries, though.
Right.
I mean, so he had 3 separate injuries. It's such a common problem. The way you get around it, that's a little tricky for him because he never actually had bone tenderness, is it wherever that fracture or the bone is being overloaded, if you put pressure on it and now all of a sudden it hurts worse, you're overloading it. If you get pain in that exact spot, you're overloading it, especially if there's nothing else that can explain there being pain there. Easy, obvious ones are going to be the front of your tibia, the side of your fibula, the bones on your metatarsals, like where it's just the bones there. There's nothing else that's going to be causing pain in that area. And it's a sharp, gross pain when you touch it, like a very uncomfortable symptom. If that increases after the activity you do, you're overloading it. It doesn't matter if it seems like it's too light. And if you find that you're not able to progress, you're underfueling.
How do you kind of modify when you're rehabbing a bone? Is that something where you want to load it? Do you not want to load it?
You have to load bone. But if you don't,
Let it heal first.
it has to heal first. It has to become symptom free. The tests for it have to be negative, and then you gradually load it, always monitoring to see if the bone's getting overloaded. The hardest cases I've ever had have been athletes at college who get unloaded for too long. And it's because people they're not paying attention, or they don't know how to differentiate if it's being overloaded, and they're not giving the athlete the tools to make sure that they're getting enough fuel. I mean, I've had collegiate, really I've run into it a lot with collegiate female runners, but I've had it with wrestlers, I've had it with gymnasts, if you have football, basketball, it's a lot of different sports where the athlete is just under fueling and they don't realize how many calories they need to be consuming to be able to do the sport they're doing, and they're not eating well. Those situations, the person can basically, the bone isn't getting enough support to heal itself, and then they go back to an activity that it can't handle, and it's not graduated, it's not built in a way that they can handle the load. And I've seen it in multiple careers.
I focused a ton on nutrition a little bit prior to actually breaking the bone, which I think was helpful in just ensuring that I had all the proper nutrients to heal as best as I could. But then I also had to be immobilized for, I want to say, 13 weeks, which is kind of the opposite, where I was fully untrained, and I think is what led to some of the kind of future injuries with the tendon not being as healthy. And, you know, all the bones in my hand I was not osteoporosis, but whatever's before that, osteopenia. Yeah.
Well, you have specific injury. So he had a scaphoid fracture. So there are also peculiarities of the specific bone that you end up hurting. The scaphoid, for example, is shaped and vascularized in such a way that it's prone to dying.
Yeah.
And it makes the rehab trickier. We've actually come in late on rehabs where people load that bone too soon.
Yeah.
Because they don't respect that the bone has to have enough time to heal. And if you don't allow that to heal, so that's an extra complication on his healing timetable that just, you have to have it worked in. And if you're not sure, if you're working with somebody and they're not confident about what they're doing, that's one where experience, or at least some level of experience around it, really matters. The ones in the lower leg and that we see, like the stress fractures, the most common part is people don't respect that the load that you have to be able to handle and the force that you have to absorb. I mean, if you're an elite runner and you're going at, sub 5 minute pace and you're doing it for miles, the load that you're
so much stress.
It's so much stress, and it's being respectful of it and understanding that the damage is now done, and you can't fast forward through it. You have to put things in order to make sure that it actually heals, because you don't want to lose another season to it. And you have to respect that if you push through and it's a high risk stress fracture, you could end your career. And if you have somebody where it seems to be lingering too long, don't think that that's normal, because it's not. Like, you should absolutely reach out and make sure that you're actually getting the right therapy that you need.
Healing timeline for bones.
Man, it's the same thing. If depending on what type it is, and it's a low risk stress fracture, you can really get somebody through a program in about 6 weeks to maybe 8 weeks, where they're back to doing running or loading. Complicated a scaphoid fracture,
a year.
Yeah. It can take a really long time. I mean, you have 3 pathologies along with a high level of activity that anyone's to return to. It's a complicated rehab, and so overloading it is going to be built into the timeline, because we know it's going to happen and we have to respect it. But at the end of the day, worst case scenario, we kill a scaphoid. So when the worst case scenario is so high, you have to really augment what you're willing to let the bone handle and slowly build it back up. That's why the timeline and really thinking through what's the worst case scenario for this. Well, the worst case is really bad. We have to respect that it's really bad. So we're not going to allow overload to happen.
Yeah, just taking it slow. Cool. Next up is the fascia. I don't even know what fascia is, but
it's interesting. I don't know why fascia seems so uninteresting to me as a tissue. I think it's because it's one of them where everything gets blamed on the fascia.
What is the fascia?
Fascia is a tissue that covers over your muscle, and you have a fascial connection of all of your muscle and over all of your muscle tissue. It basically goes over your entire body, and you have the fascia can basically get damaged, and you can have where the gliding of the fascia doesn't work as well. And one of the big things with the fascia is that it basically, like your muscle, when it contracts, it will push against the fascia, and that broadening effect will actually stabilize and stiffen the entire system. It's really cool. It interconnects it. And if you're interested in it, there's a really cool book that talks about it called Anatomy Trains. And the guy goes through, and I think there's a whole bunch of pieces where he overreaches on his interpretation, but there's some cool takeaways from the stuff that they're doing where you can mobilize fascia and reduce symptoms. I find that fascia is very hard to diagnose. People will do, like, for example, palpation or some testing. I don't think we have great tests for fascia from a clinically. You'll see,
like where is your fascia? Like, where are people getting facial injuries? Is that a
fascial injuries. You've heard of terms where people have like a myofascial syndrome.
Yeah, and I've heard of like myofascial release. Like, I don't know what that is. Is that like where they're scraping you?
Yeah, they'll do these basically techniques that are thought to help with the glide and the health of the fascia that's overlapping the muscle. So they can be fairly aggressive techniques. You also see physicians who'll do hydrodissections. Well, they'll go in with a needle under ultrasound, and they'll basically lift the fascia off the muscle. And having conversations with those those physicians, they're interesting conversations, and it's I don't know if I'm totally bought into the fascial craze, but I have seen people who get fascial work and it be incredibly helpful for them. But my brain always goes to is it really that the fascia changed because it's a dense connective tissue, right? Or is it that they treated the pain system more effectively? Or was it the muscle that was actually causing the symptoms? So that for me, there's a little bit of, I'm still monitoring. I'm not 100% sure on if I fully buy into everything around fascia, but signs that you're overloading are actually going to be very similar to muscle, and you're going to have increased soreness. You're going to start to see things that shouldn't hurting, achiness, especially the day after. To me, those are all signs that you're overloading that whole system.
Okay. What's the healing timeline for your fascia?
Boof. It's not short. If it's a connective tissue turnover, this is one more, I think there's a chronicity to it. So these are individuals where I think when I start to think fascia, I'm thinking, okay, I've worked through these other tissues, almost like a tissue diagnostic of exclusion, where I know the muscle's looking really good. The tendon's looking really healthy. Bone is fine. Everything else is fine, but they're still having this kind of nastiness, this nasty symptom. Now I'm starting to think, okay, they're either had nociplastic changes, which we'll get to in a second, or maybe there is a fascial piece. And at that point, I'm thinking 6 months to a year to 18 months, or it's a chronic thing that always has to be managed.
Oh, that sounds terrible.
It is. It is. Yeah. I mean, I don't know why. I'm not saying I'm not sold on it. It's one of those areas where I think that there's going to be there's a lot of cool research happening that's talking about fascia. I think there's a lot of cool practitioners are out there that are really digging into it. I'm not sold on it because I often find people who come in with fascial syndromes, they have an underlying thing that we're able to diagnose that seems to help clean it up. But I do think it's a piece of it, but I think it's one that I don't go full bore on unless I've ruled out these other tissues.
Almost like a secondary pathology to something else.
Yes.
Got it.
Yes.
All right. Last but not least, 9 of 9 are ligamentes.
Man. Ligamentas? Ligaments. Ligaments connect bone to bone. Your most common one that you'll see, right? You have your MCL, your ACL, your PCL, your LCL, things like around your knee. Ligaments basically stabilize the joint. It's a passive structure. When you hurt these, you can strain it or you can tear it. And there's some of them that, like, for example, your anterior talofibular ligament in your ankle, ATFL.
Has a lot of words.
Has a lot of proprioceptors in it. Has a lot of nerves. Has a lot of nerves that tell you where you're at in space. A lot of people tear it. It's not a ligament that really holds anything in place. So there's a sensory component to ligaments. And if you damage them, one of the big signs is that you'll feel unstable. And it's because you've lost some of the sensory input. I think it's a really good sign that you're overloading it. A really key one is it'll feel unstable. Doesn't mean that you retore it, but it can mean that you're overloading the system and you're not able to tell where your body's at in space. And so I like to use things to train them to basically get that system back online, get your other system that's still there to work better, and then to monitor if you feel unstable.
And isometrics, I think, are one of the best ways to help.
Mm-hmm. Isometrics are a great way to work on that. if you swell, so this one, I find ligaments can actually mirror tendon and they can mirror joint. Obviously, they're heavily involved with joint stability. These can also, if you start to see swelling around the area, if you start to see stiffness like you see with the joint, but I'll actually check joint motion on these ones as well. If you have loss of motion, so ligaments I like to pair really closely with joint.
Whenever I think of ligaments, I think of just ankle sprains because as a kid and growing up an athlete, I was just spraining my ankles every 2 to 3 weeks. Then, I'd go get on the bike, it'd feel good again, then I'd go play again and sprain it again. Cooper Flagg also just destroyed his ankle. They say he's going to be able to play in the tournament next week, which, what's the healing timeline for ligaments?
Well, so if it is just a tear of his ligament and it's just the ATFL, I think that's reasonable, especially if they're doing things to manage the swelling.
It looked like his side of his ankle touched the ground.
Yeah. So they're going to basically, the other part that we see often with this is that gets missed is that you'll have a joint injury combined with the ligament injury. And I would love to see what his ankle actually looked like, because you can manage the, because oftentimes with the pain around like an ankle sprain, you can drop the pain dramatically by doing manual lymphatic drainage. So getting the chemical irritation drop down immediately. You can work the muscles that you also strained, which is really going to be common for a lot of those muscles that control where the ankle's at to become painful. You drop all those down, you traction the ankle because it's common to develop a traumatic synovitis of the talocrural joint when you sprain your ankle. You traction it, you do manual lymphatic drainage, you do constant compression, you do all those things, and you can turn an ankle sprain around very fast. It's not going to handle much overload, right? You're going to have a massive negative response if you do too much. So in his situation, it's going to be managing the overload. Like he's going to overload it. It's like, how do you, I think that's kind of fun. It's like they're going to have to balance him not overloading it, but also making sure that he doesn't destroy his ankle because his risk for blowing it out, yikes. I cannot.
Well, and they're probably just going to tape the heck out of it. I mean, I know just in volleyball, anytime I had an ankle injury, they just start wrapping that tape up, and it's like you've got enough stiffness and stability to where you can still perform your actions, but like any little tweak is
too much,
exquisitely painful.
Well, the nasty part, so to go farther on those, people who get their ankles battered, they do the taping like you're talking about, the most common injury I see after that is a calcaneal cuboid joint sprain, and it also doesn't take the tenosynovium outside of which we didn't even get into, but the tenosynovium is still an issue. So you can get a stretch tension on the tenosynovium, which is also nasty painful. And individuals who get their ankles taped over and over again, they'll get lateral forefoot pain. That's really common. That's a calcaneal cuboid joint. So you can traction that joint as well. But it's monitoring all of those things and making sure you can pull apart each of the joints that's irritated, and then the tendons, and then the ligaments. But if anybody ever wants to see how quickly they can get back from an ankle sprain, we're always game to kind of walk through it if you guys want to dive more into what an ankle sprain looks like and all the tissues that could be causing the pain.
Yeah, drop a comment below if you've got an ankle sprain currently, and maybe we can help you out on the next episode.
Kaboom.
Okay, to close it out,
we did do tenosynovium though.
I don't even know what that is.
Let me see.
It's not on the list. Anyway, let's talk about pain mechanisms. And how do they relate here? There's a couple of words here that you mentioned one earlier. I can't even say them.
The most important, there's 3 pain mechanisms, all right? The first one is nociceptive. Nociceptive are the afferent nerves of your pain system that basically send stimulus that's overloading it. And that can be chemical, it can be pressure, it can be a bunch of different stimulus that basically thermal, that basically get into interpreted or pass a threshold and then send the signal up to your spinal cord, which then sends it up to your thalamus via the spinal thalamic tract. And when it hits your thalamus, that's when you're going to have perception that you actually have pain.
I have no clue what you just said.
I just said a whole bunch of words. All that is, the nociceptive system is going to be the one that you're going to feel for.
Can I get nociceptive for dummies over here?
Nociceptive for dummies. So your bone, your joint, your tendon, muscle, ligament, tenosynovium, those are all going to be nociceptive symptoms. Now, the next one, neuropathic pain.
I've heard of that before.
You have neuropathic pain. I have neuropathic pain. They can present in different ways. It can be, mine sometimes presents like I feel like my leg is being dipped in acid, which is a horrible feeling. And
You're not the Terminator.
I'm
So
not the Terminator. It does not feel good. And, but your neuropathic pain can be really bad. It just basically means that you've injured your nerve. So that can be, it's common with like radiculopathies, with peripheral nerve injuries, diabetic neuropathy. I'm blanking on it. Shingles. Like you can have these different types of nerve pain, and it's just like a really specific lancinating, electrical, burning. It's like a kind of a really intense pain. It's very clearly different than the nociceptive pain. The last mechanism that we see is what's called nociplastic pain. You're going to see nociplastic changes is where your nervous system has changed and how it's interpreting what's going on, and it doesn't indicate tissue damage. It means that you're now going to get stuff that the threshold for you to get symptoms is lower. You're going to get more intensity. It's like you basically wired your system to basically experience pain, and it has nothing to do with the tissue itself, the original tissue injury.
yeah, I feel like I've got a combo of those in my calf and probably more to come in my wrist.
And we'll do a deep dive on all three of those and how the whole system interacts. And we'll throw the terms out that Alex has no idea what I'm saying.
Yeah. There was a lot of long words in there that I don't know if any of those are real, and we'll fact check those.
Fact check.
All right. What's the key takeaway when misidentifying pain?
Biggest thing with misidentifying pain is that you're going to go after the wrong treatment strategy. So the whole idea of no pain, no gain does not work here. So you want to make sure that you understand what you're experiencing, what tissue is being overloaded, and how you're going to basically make sure that you're keeping your focus on tissue capacity, not exercise capacity.
All righty. Drop a comment below if you've got pain, and we'll help out with a deep dive there. Aside from that, like, comment, subscribe, share, follow, share, like,
and follow. All right. PYP, baby.
Peace.